It was a Tuesday, a day of comforting, domestic rhythms. In the warm glow of their Detroit bungalow's kitchen, Simone Grant wiped down the last of the dinner dishes. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary still hung in the air. In the living room, their 5-year-old son Leo was narrating an epic battle between a Lego dinosaur and a team of multicolored knights, his small voice a perfect soundtrack to their peaceful life. David, her partner of 8 years, was in his small home office off the kitchen, the soft clatter of his keyboard a familiar, reassuring hum. It was a life built of these small, solid moments, a fortress of love and stability she had carefully constructed. Her phone was charging in the bedroom, so when she remembered she needed to order more watercolor paper for Leo's preschool project, she walked over to David's laptop, left open on the granite island. It was a common habit, this easy sharing of their digital lives. She was about to open a new tab when his email inbox caught her eye. It was an email from a sender she didn't recognize, with a subject line that was clinically innocuous. Your results are ready to view. Case number G771, P2. Curiosity, not suspicion, made her pause. She figured it was related to the life insurance physical he'd had last week. She clicked on it. The body of the email was brief, directing the user to a secure portal to view a PDF attachment. But it was the name of the sender, visible in the email signature, that made a cold knot of dread begin to form in her stomach. Detroit Paternity and DNA Services. Paternity? The word seemed alien, a term from daytime television, not from her life with David, the life they had built. A tremor started in her hand as she moved the cursor and clicked on the attached file. The document that opened was a sterile, impersonal grid of genetic markers and legal disclaimers. Her eyes scanned the dense text, her mind refusing to process the words. Then, at the bottom of the second page, she saw the summary. It was laid out with the brutal, simple clarity of a death certificate. Testing Participant 1, alleged father. David H. Chen. Testing Participant 2 child. Leo Grant Chen. Conclusion. The probability of paternity is 0%. Based on the genetic markers analyzed, the alleged father, David H. Plank Chen, is excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Grant Chen. 0%. The number was an abyss. It was an impossibility. Her mind rejected it outright, a lab error, a mix-up. It had to be. But then, a second, more horrifying realization crashed down upon her, a wave of ice water that stole the breath from her lungs. It wasn't about the result, it was about the test. David, her David. The man she loved, the man whose child she had carried, had secretly taken a sample of their son's DNA, sent it to a lab, and ordered a paternity test. The thought was a physical violation. He had looked at her, at the life they shared, at their beautiful, laughing son, and had harbored a doubt so profound, so corrosive, that it had driven him to this back-alley betrayal. He hadn't come to her. He hadn't trusted her enough to voice his fears. He had moved in the shadows of their own home, treating her not as his partner, but as a suspect. The sounds of Leo's Lego battle faded into a distant, buzzing static. The warm, safe kitchen suddenly felt like a cold, hostile stage. With shaking hands, she hit print. She needed to hold the betrayal in her hands, to feel the weight of the paper that had just invalidated every moment of the last 8 years. The number was a lie, a statistical error. But the question that had prompted it was the truth. And it was a truth that ripped her world apart. As she heard the scrape of his office chair and his approaching footsteps, she clutched the warm paper from the printer, a testament to a doubt that had just destroyed everything. That foundation of doubt was a mockery of the foundation of love she believed they had built. Her mind recoiled from the cold, sterile printout and fled back in time, back 8 years to a life before the house, before Leo, before the lie. It fled to the moment she had chosen him. David had been a quiet storm in her life. She had grown up in a world curated by her mother, Eleanor Grant, a world of ambitious, respectable black men, lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs, men who were loud and confident, men who, like her late father, could command a room. David was none of those things. He was a graphic designer with a sketchbook full of beautiful, intricate drawings and a laugh that was soft and genuine. He didn't command rooms. He observed them. He listened. And when Simone spoke, He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. Their love was not a whirlwind. It was a slow, deep current that had pulled her gently but irrevocably away from the shore of her mother's expectations. Eleanor Grant, a matriarch in the truest sense of the word, did not approve. Her disapproval was not overt or cruel, but a steady, condescending pressure. She would serve him tea in her immaculate Detroit living room, her smile tight, her questions pointed. "A designer. How lovely," she'd said once. The word lovely, carrying the weight of a dismissal. "But does it provide, David? Does it have a future? My Simone is used to a certain kind of life." She saw his quiet nature as weakness, his artistic career as a frivolous hobby, not the work of a man who could lead a family. The confrontation had come on a Sunday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of Eleanor's famous pot roast and unspoken judgment. "He's a nice boy, Simone," Eleanor had said, her voice laced with that infuriating, knowing pity. "But he's not a leader. He can't give you the strength you need." Simone, for the first time in her life, had pushed back against the formidable force of her mother. "Mama, you think strength is about being the loudest man in the room. I think it's about being the most loyal one," she had said, her own voice shaking but firm. "David's strength is in his kindness, in his integrity. He doesn't have to lead me. He walks beside me. He's my partner, not my provider." She had chosen him. In that moment, she had chosen their shared future over her mother's carefully constructed blueprint for her life. It was the first great sacrifice she had made for their love, and it had felt like a declaration of independence. Their relationship felt stronger, more authentic, because it had been forged in defiance. She believed their partnership was a fortress, built on a foundation of mutual respect, and a love so true it could withstand any external pressure. Now, standing in her kitchen with the proof of his betrayal clutched in her hand, the memory of that long-ago battle felt like a bitter joke. She had fought for him, defended his honor, and staked her entire future on the belief that their trust was absolute. She never imagined the treachery would come not from the outside world, but from within the very walls of the fortress she had fought so hard to build. And the first great stone of that fortress, the one that was supposed to make them unbreakable, was the child he now secretly believed wasn't his. That child, the beautiful, innocent boy now playing in the other room, was supposed to be the keystone of their fortress. The memory of his creation, so vivid and now so contested, flooded Simone's mind. It wasn't an easy journey. After 2 years of trying, the positive pregnancy test had felt like a miracle, a joyous, private celebration between them. Her mother, Eleanor, had been ecstatic, her earlier reservations about David melting away in the face of becoming a grandmother. For a few blissful months, their future seemed perfect, a straight, sunlit path. Then, at 20 weeks, the complications began. The diagnosis was placenta previa, a serious condition that came with a battery of frightening risks and one non-negotiable prescription: immediate and indefinite bed rest. Her world, once vibrant and active, shrank to the 4 walls of their bedroom. The life she had known was put on hold, her body becoming a vessel whose only job was to stay still, to protect the fragile life inside her. Those were the longest 4 months of her life. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of anxiety and boredom. She, a woman who prided herself on her independence, was now utterly dependent, a prisoner in her own home. But through it all, David had been her unwavering anchor. He transformed. The quiet, thoughtful man she loved became a fierce, tender protector. He became her hands and feet, her connection to the world outside their bedroom. He took over everything. He learned to cook her favorite meals, his first few attempts comically bad, but he persisted until he perfected them. He did the grocery shopping, the cleaning, the laundry, all while juggling his own demanding freelance design projects. He converted his work setup, cramming his large drafting monitor and computer onto a small desk in the corner of their bedroom, just so he could be near her during the day. But it was his emotional support that had truly solidified their bond. He would read to her for hours, his calm voice a soothing balm on her frayed nerves. He learned to give the most incredible foot massages. He would come home with small, thoughtful gifts, a bar of her favorite lavender soap, a pint of ice cream he knew she was craving. He set up date nights in their room, balancing his laptop on a stack of pillows so they could watch movies while eating takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. He listened without judgment to her middle of the night, fears about the baby's health, holding her and whispering reassurances until she fell back asleep. During that long, terrifying ordeal, they weren't just a couple in love anymore. They were a team, a single unit fighting a quiet, daily battle. When Leo was finally born, healthy and screaming with life, the moment felt like a shared victory, the triumphant end to a war they had waged and won together. She remembered looking at David in the hospital room, his face awash with tears as he held their tiny, perfect son for the first time. She saw the profound, unconditional love in his eyes, and she knew, with a certainty that felt as solid as the earth itself, that their bond was unbreakable. The birth of their son had been their shared miracle. David had been her constant protector, her devoted partner. She had known, in that moment, that there was no trial they couldn't overcome together. So when his own crisis came years later, when his own body betrayed him, she had not hesitated for a second to be his rock in return, offering him a silent, unquestioning trust she never imagined he wasn't also giving her. That unwavering trust was a promise she had made to him, a debt of loyalty she had been all too willing to pay. The memory, barely a year old, was still raw. The crisis had arrived not in a sudden crash, but in a quiet, clinical phone call from a doctor: testicular cancer. The words had dropped into their peaceful life like a stone, sending terrifying ripples through everything. Simone had immediately prepared for battle, ready to become the same pillar of strength for him that he had been for her. But his reaction was not what she expected. Where she had craved his constant presence during her time of need, he craved an immediate, impenetrable solitude. He became a stranger in their own home. He went to his oncology appointments alone. He would return and retreat to his office for hours, the door closed, offering only clipped, vague assurances like "it went fine" or "the doctor is optimistic." He didn't want to talk about the prognosis, the treatment options, the terrifying details that were consuming her thoughts. "I just need to process this my own way, Simone," he'd said one night, his voice gentle but firm, creating an unbreachable distance between them. "It's my body, my fight. I don't want to burden you with it. Please, just trust me. I'll get through this, and we'll come out the other side. Stronger." It was agonizing. She felt shut out, helpless. Her mother, of course, had stoked her fears. "A man is supposed to lean on his wife in times like this, Simone," Eleanor had said over the phone. "What is he hiding in all that silence?" But Simone had pushed her mother's suspicions away. She remembered how he had sat by her bed for months, supporting her in exactly the way she had needed. Now, she had to do the same for him. She had to honor the way he needed to fight his battle. So she made a conscious, painful sacrifice. She gave him her trust. She gave him the space he asked for, a gift that cost her dearly in sleepless nights and silent anxiety. She never pushed, never pried. She focused on keeping their world stable, creating a bubble of normalcy and love for Leo, ensuring that the home David returned to each day was a sanctuary, not an interrogation chamber. She would sit in the living room, hearing his deep, rattling coughs from a chemo session through his closed office door, and her heart would break with the need to go to him. But she would stay put. She was trusting him. When the treatment was over, and the doctors finally, blessedly, declared him in remission, he had collapsed into her arms, his body thin and weak, but his spirit returning. "I couldn't have done it without you," he'd whispered, his face buried in her neck. "Thank you for trusting me, for giving me the space to fight. Thank you." She had held him, believing their partnership had passed its final, most difficult test. She believed his gratitude was for her patience, for her quiet strength. Now, standing in the kitchen with the DNA test clutched in her fist, the ugly, sickening truth was clear. His silence hadn't been a shield to protect her, it had been a smokescreen to hide a truth he couldn't face. And her trust hadn't been a sacred gift, it had been a convenient opportunity. An opportunity for him to grieve a reality he was hiding from her. An opportunity to investigate her, to put their son's very existence on trial without her ever knowing. The sound of his office door opening, the soft tread of his footsteps on the hardwood floor, pulled her sharply from the past. The time for silent trust was over. It was time for a reckoning. David walked into the kitchen, a tired but gentle smile on his face, a smile that died the instant he saw her. Simone stood by the kitchen island, rigid as a statue, the printed DNA report clutched in her white-knuckled fist. The warm, domestic air of moments before had become thick with a cold, electric tension. He saw the paper, saw the look in her eyes, and the color drained from his face. He knew. "I stood up to my mother for you," Simone's voice began, low and trembling with a rage that had been forged in the fire of her memories. "I put my body and our son's life on the line for 4 months, trapped in a bed, trusting you. I gave you my blind faith when you were sick, defending your silence when every instinct told me something was wrong." Her voice rose with each remembered sacrifice. "And this is how you repay me? This is the thanks I get? You spy on me? You go behind my back and test our child, our Leo, because you thought I was some cheap whore sleeping around?" She didn't wait for an answer. With a cry that was a mixture of a sob and a scream, she threw the paper at him. It fluttered through the air between them, a white flag of surrender from a war she never knew they were fighting, before settling on the hardwood floor. He didn't flinch. He didn't get angry or defensive. He just stood there and took it, his shoulders slumping as if under a physical weight. The reaction was so alien to what she'd expected, so completely dissonant with the actions of a suspicious husband, that it momentarily stunned her into silence. The expression on his face wasn't indignation. It was a deep, soul-crushing sadness, a guilt so profound it looked like a mortal wound. Slowly, as if his limbs were made of lead, he bent down and picked up the report. He folded it carefully, his movements deliberate, before looking up at her, his eyes full of a grief that mirrored her own. "You have every right to say all of that, Simone," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Every right. And you have every right to hate me for the rest of your life, but you're wrong." "Wrong?" The word exploded from her. "Wrong about what, David? That you did this? That you violated my trust? Our son's privacy? It's right there in your hands." "No," he said, shaking his head, his gaze unwavering. "You're wrong about why. I have never, not for one single solitary second of our life together, believed you would ever cheat on me. I know you didn't. I know that with every fiber of my being." His words were a hammer to the very architecture of her rage. It made no sense. It was a logical impossibility. "Then why?" she whispered, her anger faltering, replaced by a chilling, terrifying confusion. "Why would you do this?" He took a shaky step closer, his face a portrait of agony. "The test was never for you, Sai. It was for me." He held her gaze, and she saw a man on the edge of a precipice. "It wasn't to see if you had betrayed me. It was to confirm a secret I've been keeping for a year, a secret I was too much of a coward to tell you." He let out a ragged breath. "It's not what you think. It's so much worse." His words hung in the air, completely dismantling her fury and leaving a frigid vacuum in its place. He knew she hadn't cheated. The certainty in his voice was absolute. But if that was true, then the last hour, the last 8 years, made no sense at all. The simple, sordid story of a suspicious partner was wrong. And as she looked into his grief-stricken eyes, she realized he was about to tell her a story far more terrible than the one she could have ever imagined. Simone braced herself, her anger now a distant echo, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. David's confession didn't come out in a rush, but in slow, painful waves, the story of a secret he had carried like a sickness for the past year. He took her back to his cancer diagnosis, a time she remembered as a blur of her own, quiet, supportive fear. For him, she now realized, it had been a horror of a completely different kind. Before they started the chemo, he began, his voice low and hollow, "The oncologist told me I should bank my sperm. He said the treatment would almost certainly make me sterile, and he wanted us to have the option for more kids later." He sank onto one of the kitchen stools, his body looking impossibly heavy. "So I went. To the fertility clinic. It was supposed to be a routine precaution." He let out a dry, mirthless laugh. It was anything but. He described the clinical sterile room, the awkwardness of the procedure, and then the follow-up call from the doctor a few days later. The doctor had been hesitant, his voice full of a clinical pity that David would come to know well. The lab had found no sperm, not a low count, 0. The medical term was azoospermia. "My first thought was that the cancer had already destroyed everything," David continued, his eyes fixed on the floor, but the oncologist was concerned. "He said the type of cancer I had shouldn't have caused that. He sent me to a geneticist." This was the secret he had hidden behind his closed office door, behind his claims of needing to process things alone. It wasn't just the specter of cancer he had been wrestling with. It was a complete annihilation of his identity. The genetic tests had come back with a definitive answer. He had a rare condition, a microdeletion on his Y chromosome. The cancer hadn't made him sterile. He had been born that way. He had always been sterile. The confession landed in the quiet kitchen, sucking all the air out of the room. This was the so much worse. This was the source of his grief, and it was the reason for the DNA test. "I didn't know what to do, Simone," he whispered, finally looking at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding she couldn't begin to give. "My entire world had been pulled out from under me. I was fighting for my life, and at the same time, I learned that I could never create one, and I would look at Leo, our perfect, beautiful son, and my heart would just break, because I knew. It was a biological impossibility." He gestured to the DNA report still on the counter. "The test wasn't a question, Sai. It was a confirmation of the nightmare. I had to see it in black and white. I had to know that what the doctors were telling me was real." This was the fake twist. He wasn't a suspicious husband. He was a man shattered by a cruel biological fate. He had exonerated himself from the crime of mistrust, but in doing so, he had placed her in the defendant's chair for a crime far greater. He never said the words, but the accusation hung between them, thick and suffocating. If he had been sterile his entire life, then she must have cheated 5 years ago. Leo was the product of her infidelity. "David," she started, her own voice a whisper now. I would never cheat on you. You know that." "I know," he said, and the tragedy in his voice was that she believed he meant it. He believed in her fidelity, yet he held the proof of her transgression. She was trapped in a nightmare of logic. The science said he was sterile. Her heart, her soul, her own inviolable memory of their life together screamed that she had been faithful. Both things could not possibly be true. And yet, as she stood in the ruins of her kitchen, of her life, they were. One of them was wrong about the past. And she knew with every fiber of her being it wasn't her. The kitchen, which had been the stage for the demolition of her life, now became Simone's prison. David retreated back into a familiar silence, this time not in his office, but in their guest room, leaving Simone to grapple with the shrapnel of his confession. She felt as though she were losing her mind, trapped in a terrifying paradox. On one side was the immovable object, science, azoospermia, Y, chromosome microdeletion, a DNA test with a 0% probability. These were facts, printed in cold black ink on a piece of paper that felt like a death warrant for her reality. They were absolute, impersonal, and according to every law of nature, they were the truth. On the other side was the unstoppable force, her memory. She knew she hadn't cheated. It wasn't a vague belief. It was a certainty anchored in one of the most vivid and cherished memories of her life. The night Leo was conceived, it was their 2nd anniversary. They had gone to a small, jazz-themed restaurant downtown. She remembered the dress she wore, a deep blue velvet that David loved. She remembered the taste of the wine, the sound of the saxophone playing a soulful rendition of a Coltrane ballad. She remembered going home, to this very house, and making love with a tenderness and passion that felt sacred. Her memory wasn't a story she told herself. It was a truth she had lived, a truth she felt in her very bones. How could both things be true? The question tormented her. For 2 days, she barely slept, her mind endlessly replaying her past, searching for a crack, a forgotten moment, a drunken night that never happened. Had she lost her mind? Was it possible to betray the love of your life and have no memory of it? The thought was so antithetical to her own identity, so completely alien to the person she knew herself to be, that it felt more insane than the paradox itself. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating weight of the impossibility alone, she called Maya. She drove to her friend's law office, a sleek, modern space that felt like a bastion of logic in her chaotic world, and laid out the entire insane story. Maya listened, her expression shifting from empathetic concern to sharp, analytical focus. She leaned back in her leather chair, her fingers steepled. "Okay," she said slowly. "Let's break this down. I've known you since we were kids, Sai. You are not a cheater, and you are not crazy. Let's start with those 2 things as facts." Simone felt a wave of relief, so profound it almost made her weep. "But," Maya continued, her lawyer's brain taking over, "we have to be real. Memory, especially emotional memory, is a powerful but tricky thing. It's not a video recording. It can be flawed. A paternity test, on the other hand, That's just data. It isn't emotional. It just is. Simone's heart sank. She thought Maya was siding with the science. But then her friend leaned forward, her eyes sharp. But here's the thing that matters. I believe you, 100%. Which means the narrative here isn't your memory versus the science. It means we are missing a fundamental piece of the story. It means something else happened 5 years ago that you don't know about. The facts aren't wrong, Simone. The story you were told about those facts is. Maya's words were a key, unlocking a door in Simone's mind that she didn't even know was there. It wasn't that she was crazy, it was that she was uninformed. She hadn't been a participant in her own life. She had been a spectator to a play whose script had been hidden from her. A wave of fear, but also a sliver of empowering clarity, washed over her. There was an explanation. All she had to do was find it. And there was only one person, besides David, who had been there for every step of their journey to have Leo, every doctor's appointment, every scare. Her mother. She needed her mother's wisdom. She needed the comfort of the one person in the world she knew she could trust with her entire soul. The drive to her mother's house was a pilgrimage toward the last sanctuary she had left in the world. Eleanor Grant's home in the historic Boston Edison district was the unchanging center of Simone's universe, a monument of brick and ivy, filled with the scent of lemon polish and the quiet, formidable strength of the woman who lived there. It was the house she had grown up in, a place of safety and absolute truth. Today, she came to it as a refugee from her own life, desperate for comfort. Eleanor was in the living room, arranging a bouquet of lilies, her movements precise and elegant. She saw the look on Simone's face, and her expression hardened with a familiar, maternal concern. "Simone, baby, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Simone collapsed onto the plush velvet sofa, the story tumbling out of her in a torrent of pain and confusion. She told her mother everything. The DNA test, David's shocking confession of his lifelong infertility, the impossible paradox that was tormenting her. She laid the entire insane story at her mother's feet, expecting her to be horrified, to wrap her in her arms and declare that they would face this madness together. She was expecting a mother's embrace. She was met with a wall of ice. Eleanor did not move to comfort her. She didn't even sit down. She stood by the fireplace, her back ramrod straight, her knuckles white as she gripped the mantelpiece. When she spoke, her voice was not soft with sympathy, but brittle with a cold, simmering rage that was directed entirely, and immediately, at David. "That man," Eleanor seethed, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "I told you from the day you brought him home, Simone. I told you there was something weak in his spirit, something deceitful." "Mama, no, that's not it," Simone stammered, confused by the misplaced anger. "The doctors confirmed it. He's—" "I don't give a damn what his doctors said." Eleanor cut her off, her voice rising. "Men like that, quiet, sneaky men, they are experts at manipulation. He is doing this to break you, to make you think you're crazy. A man who would keep his own sickness a secret from his wife is a man capable of any kind of lie. This is his fault, all of it." It was the strangest reaction. It was as if her mother wasn't even listening to the core of the problem. Simone was grappling with an impossible scientific and emotional reality, and her mother was focused on a simple, venomous character assassination. Every time Simone tried to steer the conversation back to the central mystery, how could Leo not be his if I was never with anyone else? Eleanor would aggressively deflect, circling back to David's supposed treachery. Simone, who had come here seeking clarity, found only a thicker, more suffocating fog. A small, cold seed of a new and even more terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. Her mother wasn't behaving like a grandmother shocked to her core by a revelation about her grandson's paternity. She wasn't behaving like a mother whose daughter was in the midst of a psychological crisis. She was behaving like a cornered animal, spitting and clawing to protect a secret. The most chilling part was what her mother wasn't. She wasn't surprised. Simone drove away from the immaculate brick house 20 minutes later, the scent of lilies clinging to her clothes. She had come seeking an anchor and had been handed a stone. Her mother's fury wasn't the righteous anger of a protective parent, it was the panicked lashing out of a gatekeeper whose gate was about to be breached. For the first time in her 40 years of life, a question she never thought she would be capable of forming, a question that felt like the ultimate blasphemy, rose in her mind. What if David wasn't the only person who had been lying to her all along? The seed of suspicion, once planted, grew into a suffocating vine, choking out the last vestiges of Simone's lifelong trust in her mother. She drove straight from Eleanor's house to Maya's office, her mind a chaotic whirl of disbelief and a new, terrifying clarity. "She wasn't surprised, Maya," Simone said, pacing the length of her friend's office. "She didn't even flinch at the part about David being sterile. She just attacked. It was like she was mad the secret was out, not that the secret existed in the first place." Maya leaned forward, her expression grim. This was no longer just a marital dispute. It was a potential conspiracy. "Okay, Simone, we're past the point of trusting feelings. We need facts. Your OB divided by GYN from when you were pregnant with Leo Dr. Miller, is she still practicing?" Simone nodded. "Good," Maya said, her voice all business. "You are legally entitled to your complete medical file. I want you to go to her office tomorrow and request a full copy. Everything. Every blood test, every nurse's note, every referral. If something happened, there's a paper trail. A lie this big always leaves a trail." The next afternoon, Simone sat in her car in the parking lot of the medical center, a thick manila envelope on the passenger seat. It was her own history, her own body, documented in a stack of papers that now felt alien and threatening. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and began to sift through the contents. Most of it was familiar. The weekly blood pressure readings from her struggle with preeclampsia, the grainy, beautiful ultrasound photos of Leo, a tiny, curled shape in the darkness. The clinical notes detailing the strict regimen of her 4-month-long bed rest. It was all exactly as she remembered. Her story, her truth. And then she saw it. Tucked between a standard lab result and a hospital admission form was a single sheet of paper on a letterhead she had never seen before. The Michigan Center for Reproductive Medicine. It was a discharge summary, dated 5.5 years ago. Her name was at the top. The summary was brief, almost insultingly simple. Procedure: intrauterine insemination, EUE. Outcome: successful. Positive HCG test confirmed. Her breath hitched in her throat. Intrauterine insemination. A fertility clinic. She had no memory of this. None. It was a phantom event. A chapter from a life she had never lived. The vivid, cherished memory of the romantic anniversary night she had held on to, as her truth was suddenly ripped away, exposed as a fiction. Her mind had created a beautiful story to cover a sterile, clinical reality she hadn't even known happened. At the bottom of the page was a short, handwritten note from Dr. Miller to the clinic, a note that made Simone's blood run cold. Per patient's request, all further billing and patient communication regarding this procedure to be handled directly by Mrs. Eleanor Grant, Mether. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. She didn't cry. The time for tears was over. With a calm that terrified her, she started the car and drove back to the brick and ivy fortress in Boston Edison. She walked into her mother's home, past the family photos that were now a gallery of lies, and found Eleanor arranging tea service in the living room. Simone didn't say a word. She walked to the polished coffee table and placed the single sheet of paper down on the silver tray, next to the porcelain cups. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dead, hollow thing. "Explain this." Eleanor looked down at the letterhead from the fertility clinic, at the damning, handwritten note at the bottom. The color drained from her face. For the first time in Simone's life, she saw the formidable, unshakable Eleanor Grant completely and utterly unravel. The righteous anger was gone, the condescending certainty vanished. All that was left was the raw, primal fear of a conspirator whose crime had finally been dragged into the light. The silence in the immaculate living room stretched for a lifetime. Eleanor Grant, the unshakable matriarch, the pillar of her community, seemed to shrink before her daughter's eyes. She sank onto the velvet sofa, her hands trembling in her lap, her gaze fixed on the damning piece of paper as if it were a serpent. The confession, when it came, was not a cry of apology, but a whisper of twisted justification. "I did it for you, Simone," she began, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar thing. "Everything I have ever done, my entire life, has been to protect you, to ensure your happiness." Simone stood rigid, unmoved by the preamble. Protect me from what? From heartbreak, Eleanor said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old righteous strength. I watched you and David for 2 years, trying so desperately to have a child. I saw the sadness in your eyes every month. I saw how it was tearing you both apart. A mother can't just stand by and watch her child suffer. She recounted the story, painting herself as the proactive, loving parent who simply couldn't bear to see her daughter in pain. She spoke of her long friendship with Dr. Miller, Simone's OB, divided by GYN, a relationship built over decades of charity boards and society events. She had gone to her friend, the doctor, with her concerns. And then, Eleanor continued, her gaze distant, I went to David. Behind your back, yes, but I did it out of love. He was a good man, but he was drowning in shame, feeling like less of a man because he couldn't give you the one thing you wanted most. I went to him as an ally. I said, let's find out the truth, just us. We won't worry Simone with this until we know for sure. He was so lost, so desperate. He agreed. She described how she had arranged the secret tests for David, pulling strings to get the results fast-tracked, and she described the moment Dr. Miller had called her, not David, with the results. Azoospermia, a congenital, irreversible condición. And in that moment, Eleanor said, her eyes finally lifting to meet Simone's, a fanatic gleam of self-justification in them. I knew the truth would destroy you. It would shatter your marriage. You would see him as broken. He would live forever with the shame. The beautiful life you had built together would crumble into dust over this one biological flaw. Simone felt a wave of nausea. The violation was breathtaking. Her mother and her partner, conspiring behind her back, discussing the intimate details of their marriage, his body, their future. You had no right. Simone's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. That was his truth to tell. That was our problem to solve. You had no right to be there. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand, completely ignoring the violation of trust. A mother has every right to protect her child's happiness. And that's what I did. I made a decision to protect your marriage, to protect David's dignity, to protect you from a lifetime of disappointment. Her mother's confession was a monstrous tapestry of love twisted into an instrument of absolute control. Eleanor Grant had inserted herself into the very heart of their marriage, appointing herself the arbiter of their future. But as horrifying as it was an incomplete story. It didn't explain the most crucial piece of evidence. So, you knew, Simone said, her voice dangerously quiet, cutting through her mother's self-congratulatory narrative. You and David both knew, 5.5 years ago, that he was sterile. She took a step forward and tapped the paper on the coffee table with a single, trembling finger. But that doesn't explain this. It doesn't explain the fertility clinic. It doesn't explain the procedure with my name on it. It doesn't explain why I was the one who was treated. She locked eyes with her mother, her gaze a steel trap. What did you do, Mama? Simone's question hung in the air, a final, desperate plea for a truth that was less monstrous than the one taking shape in her mind. What did you do, Mama? Eleanor Grant took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound of a woman preparing to confess a mortal sin. The dam of her deception finally broke, and the whole, horrifying, twisted story came flooding out. She spoke of her grand, terrible solution, not as a crime, but as a masterpiece of maternal love. After we knew about David, Eleanor began, her voice regaining its composure, now laced with the unnerving calm of a zealot explaining her faith. I knew we couldn't tell you. The truth was a poison, and my only job is to protect you from poison. She described a secret meeting she'd had with David, a meeting where she had laid out her plan to the broken, desperate man. The plan was simple. It was perfect, she said, a faint, proud smile touching her lips. We wouldn't tell you that he was the one with the issue. We would tell you that you were a small thing, something easily overcome. I spoke to Dr. Miller. We decided to tell you that you had a mild case of cervical mucus hostility. It sounded scientific, serious enough to warrant a procedure, but not so serious as to cause you real distress. As her mother spoke, Simone's own memories began to shift and warp, the past reassembling itself into a new and hideous shape. She remembered that conversation with Dr. Miller. The doctor's kind, pitying eyes as she explained the good news was that it was a simple fix. She remembered the sense of relief that had washed over her. The solution, Eleanor continued, her voice warming with the memory of her own brilliance. was a simple trip to a fertility clinic, a routine intrauterine insemination, an IUI. It's a common procedure. We told you it was just to give David's sperm a helping hand, a better chance of reaching the egg. It was a clean, medical, and hopeful solution. It gave you the child you craved, and it saved David from a lifetime of shame. It was a victimless act, Simone. A loving act. A victimless act. The words were a monument to her mother's delusion. The final, terrible piece of the puzzle slid into place, and the cherished memory that had been Simone's anchor through this entire ordeal, the romantic anniversary night, shattered into a million pieces. It was a lie. A ghost. A story her own mind had concocted to fill the terrifying void of the truth. Her brain, knowing a child had been conceived, had written a beautiful, loving origin story to protect her from the sterile, clinical reality of what had actually happened. She had been treated like livestock, inseminated with a lie of omission on a cold, vinyl-covered table. Her partner and her mother had stood by and watched. They had let her believe a fiction for more than 5 years. The realization was a physical blow. She felt a wave of dizziness, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her body, her child's origin, her most sacred memory, it was all a lie, a script written and directed by her mother, with David as the tragic, co-signing actor. One final, horrifying question remained. "The sperm," Simone whispered, the words barely audible. "If it wasn't David's, whose was it?" Eleanor waved her hand dismissively, as if swatting away an irrelevant detail. "An anonymous donor. Dr. Miller and I selected the profile ourselves. A graduate student. Healthy, intelligent, good family history. We chose the very best for you, baby. We always have." The story was finally told. Simone felt a strange, terrifying calm descend upon her. She was not the author of her own life. Her mother was the writer, David was the editor, and she was merely the paper the story was written on. She looked at the woman who had given her life and then stolen it, not with the eyes of a daughter, but with the cold, detached gaze of a judge. The time for questions was over. It was time for a verdict. The confession, complete in its monstrous totality, settled in the immaculate living room, poisoning the very air Simone breathed. Her mother, having delivered her twisted gospel of love and protection, looked at her with expectant eyes, as if waiting for a twisted form of gratitude. She truly believed she had been the hero of the story. In that moment, Simone felt a profound and terrifying detachment. The grief, the rage, the confusion, they all evaporated, leaving behind a vast, cold emptiness. The life she had known was a forgery. Her most cherished memories were counterfeit. The love story she thought she was living was a meticulously crafted lie. Her mother had been the writer, David the cowardly co-author, and her own body, her own mind, had been the unwitting parchment upon which they had written their fiction. She thought of Leo, waiting at home, the one pure and true thing in this entire labyrinth of deceit. He was not the symbol of a perfect love, as she had always believed. He was the product of a conspiracy. For a terrifying second, she felt a wave of alienation, the fear that he too was a stranger. But it passed as quickly as it came, replaced by a ferocious, protective love that was the only real thing she had left. He was not the lie. He was the victim of it, just as she was. Her love for her son was the one landmark left standing in the scorched earth of her past, and it was for him, for their right to an authentic life, that she knew what she had to do. Without another word, Simone stood up. She looked at her mother, at the woman who had orchestrated this violation, and felt nothing. Not hatred, not sadness. Just the cold, clinical finality of a chapter ending. She turned and walked out of the house she grew up in, leaving Eleanor sitting alone amidst the ruins of the family she had just destroyed. When she got home, David was waiting in the living room, his face etched with anxiety. He saw her expression and knew instantly that the whole truth was out. He started to speak, the pathetic, pre-rehearsed justifications already forming on his lips. "Simone, please let me explain. I was terrified. I loved you so much, I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. Your mother, she convinced me it was the only way." Simone held up a hand, and he fell silent. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the screaming rage he had been expecting. It was far worse. It was the voice of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You didn't do it for love, David," she said, her words precise and devastating. "You did it out of fear. And you didn't just lie to me. You conspired with my mother to violate me in the most intimate way possible. You stood by and let it happen. A partner would have trusted me with the truth. A real partner would have faced the heartbreak with me, not gone behind my back to build a life based on a lie. She looked at him, at the man she had loved, defended, and sacrificed for, and saw only a coward. You weren't my partner in that clinic. You were her accomplice. She watched the last bit of hope die in his eyes, as he finally understood the absolute finality of his betrayal. "Pack your things," she said. "I want you out by morning." The fortress they had built together was a fiction, and she was tearing it down. He had lost her, not because he was sterile, but because he had chosen deception over partnership. Her mother had lost her, not because she wanted to help, but because her help was a monstrous violation of control. For 5 years, they had written her story. Now she would write the final chapter. A chapter of truth, a chapter of consequences. And she knew exactly where the story had to end. In the one place her mother's power and reputation were held most sacred. The silence in the house after David left was a strange, hollow thing. For the first time in 8 years, it was her space alone, and the emptiness was both a profound relief and a crushing weight. The storm of the initial revelation had passed, leaving behind the cold, hard landscape of the truth. Simone's purpose, which had been a vague, formless need for answers, now crystallized into a single, clear objective. She met Maya at a small, quiet coffee shop the next morning. "So what's the plan?" Maya asked, her lawyer's mind already calculating damages and legal strategies. "Divorce is a given, but for your mother, intentional infliction of emotional distress, medical fraud. We can sue her into the ground, Simone." Simone shook her head, a gesture of absolute finality. "No," she said, her voice even. "I don't want her money. That's not what she took from me. She stole my history. She stole my autonomy. She built her entire public identity as this perfect, all-loving matriarch on a foundation of my body and my child. A lawsuit is private. It's about money. I want to take away the thing she values more than money. I want to take away her reputation. I want the truth to be the only story people tell when they say the name Eleanor Grant." Maya's eyes widened slightly as she understood the depth of Simone's intent. "You want to go public. I want to go biblical," Simone corrected. "I want to tell the truth in the one place her power is absolute, the one place her reputation is unimpeachable. I'm going to do it in her church." The plan, in its elegant cruelty, was perfect. Eleanor Grant wasn't just a regular member of the First Bethel AME Zion Church. She was an institution within it. She was the long-serving head of the women's ministry, a deaconess, the matriarch whose opinion held more weight than the pastor's on most matters. The church was her stage, her kingdom, the source of all her social power. To unmask her, there wasn't just an act of revenge, it was an act of dethronement. A quick search on the church's website by Maya provided the perfect opportunity. In 2 weeks, the church was holding its annual Women of Grace Sunday service. This year's guest of honor, who would be presented with the first ever Matriarch of the Year award for a lifetime of service and devotion, was Eleanor Grant herself. The poetic irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. "It's too perfect," Maya breathed. The strategy was simple. They wouldn't interrupt or cause a scene. That would be messy, and could easily be dismissed as the hysterics of a daughter having a breakdown. Simone, as Eleanor's beloved and devoted child, called the church office and formally requested a 5-minute slot on the program to pay a special tribute to her mother. The request was granted immediately, with delighted enthusiasm. For the next 2 weeks, Simone prepared. She didn't write a speech. The story was a part of her now, etched into her soul. She spent her time with Leo, her love for him a clarifying force, a constant reminder of what was real and what she was fighting for. She gathered her evidence, the DNA report, the letter from the fertility clinic, not as props to be brandished, but as sacred texts, physical proof of her stolen history. She was terrified. The thought of standing before the community she had known her entire life and detonating a bomb in the middle of it was nauseating. But the need to own her own story, to speak her own truth after it had been silenced for so long, was a force far more powerful than fear. On the morning of the service, Simone stood before the mirror in her bedroom. She was not dressing for church. She was dressing for battle. She chose a simple, elegant sheath dress, the color of a clear winter sky. In her purse, she placed the folded papers Exhibits A and B in the trial of Eleanor Grant. She looked at her own reflection and saw not a victim, but a witness. The sole living witness to the truth of her own life. Her mother was about to be honored as a matriarch of grace. Simone was about to walk into God's house and testify to the true, monstrous nature of that grace. The interior of the First Bethel, AME. Zion Church was just as Simone remembered from her childhood. The scent of old wood and floor polish, the brilliant afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows, the palpable warmth of community. But today, the sanctuary she had always known felt like a courtroom. The pews were filled with the pillars of her community, faces she had known her entire life. It was a full house, all here to celebrate her mother. Eleanor Grant sat in the front pew, a queen holding court. She wore a tailored cream suit and a hat adorned with a single, elegant white rose. She looked regal, benevolent, the very picture of the matriarch they were there to honor. As the gospel choir sang a final soaring hymn, Simone's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She saw David sitting a few rows back, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. He knew what was coming. He was here to witness the final consequence of their shared lie. The pastor, a kind, booming man who had known Simone since she was a little girl, finally stepped to the pulpit. He spoke glowingly of Eleanor's decades of service, her leadership, her unwavering grace. The congregation murmured their amens and hallelujahs. Finally, he smiled warmly at Simone. And now, to offer a special tribute to our beloved honoree, I'd like to invite to the stage the fruit of her love and the pride of her life, her daughter, Simone Grant. A wave of warm, expectant applause followed Simone as she walked from her pew to the stage. Every eye was on her. She felt the weight of their collective story, their shared history. She could feel her mother's proud, beaming smile on her back. She stepped up to the pulpit, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of familiar faces. She began as expected. "Thank you, Pastor John. I am truly honored to be here today, to speak about my mother, Eleanor Grant, and the profound, life-altering impact she has had on my life." She paused, letting the words hang in the silent, sacred space. Her mother nodded, a tear of pride glistening in her eye. Then, Simone's tone shifted. The practiced warmth fell away, replaced by a quiet, raw, and unshakable intensity. "My mother has always taught me that the house of God is a house of truth," she said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the church. "And in that spirit of truth, I am here today to testify, not to my mother's grace, but to the true nature of her control." A confused murmur rippled through the front pews. Eleanor's proud smile faltered. Simone didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply told the story, her voice a steady, devastating metronome of facts. She told them of her and David's painful struggle to conceive. She told them of a secret medical test, conducted on her partner without her knowledge. She told them of being lied to, of being told that she was the one with a medical problem. She told them of being sent to a fertility clinic for a procedure she was told was one thing, when it was, in fact, another. "I stand before you today as the mother of a beautiful 5-year-old boy," she said, her voice ringing with a terrible clarity. "A boy I love more than my own life. A boy who, I recently learned, is not the biological son of the man I built a life with." A collective gasp swept through the church. "He is the biological son of an anonymous stranger, a fact that was kept from me. A procedure I was manipulated into, a violation of my body and my trust that was orchestrated, planned, and executed by the woman you are honoring here today. My mother." She looked directly at Eleanor. The regal mask had shattered. The color had drained from her face, leaving behind a slack, gray mask of pure, abject horror. She was exposed, shamed, and dethroned in the heart of her own kingdom, before the very people whose respect she valued more than anything. The silence in the church was absolute, the sound of a reputation, a legacy, and a lifetime of lies turning to dust. Simone stepped down from the pulpit, her testimony complete. She hadn't come for their judgment or their pity. She had come for her story. And now, for the first time in 5 years, it was finally hers. Simone stepped down from the pulpit into a maelstrom of silence. The gospel music had died. The pastor stood frozen behind her, his mouth agape. Every face in the congregation was turned towards the front pew, where Eleanor Grant sat, no longer a queen on her throne, but a statue of ash. The proud, benevolent smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of public ruin. The shame was a visible, physical thing, radiating off her in waves. Her community, her kingdom, had just witnessed her execution. Simone didn't wait for the whispers to begin. She didn't look at David. With her head held high, she walked down the center aisle, the eyes of 100 people following her every step. Maya was waiting for her at the heavy oak doors, and together they walked out into the bright, indifferent Detroit sunlight, leaving the chaos of the shattered sanctuary behind them. She had delivered her testimony. She had reclaimed her story. The fallout was no longer her burden to bear. Later that evening, David came to the house. He stood in the doorway of the home they had shared, looking like a stranger. "Can we fix this, Simone?" he asked, his voice raw with a grief she knew was real, but could no longer touch her. "The truth is out now. We can start from here. We can start over." Simone looked at him, and for the first time, she felt not anger, but a profound and weary sadness. "There's nothing left to fix, David," she said, her voice gentle but absolute. "The foundation wasn't just cracked, it was a lie from the very beginning. A partner would have trusted me with their pain, with the truth, no matter how hard. A partner would have faced the heartbreak with me." She shook her head. "You didn't choose me. You chose to follow my mother's lead. You let her make the most important decision of our lives. You weren't my partner in this, David. You were her accomplice." He had no response. The truth, in its simplicity, was irrefutable. She closed the door on their life together. The months that followed were quiet. The scandal in the community was a firestorm, but Simone refused to add any more fuel to it. She cut off all contact with her mother. She focused on the only thing that mattered: Leo. Her victory, her satisfaction, was not loud or explosive. It was in the quiet, everyday moments of her new, authentic life. It was in being able to look at her beautiful, happy son and know that his story was now hers to protect and, one day, to tell. The truth of his origin was no longer a monstrous secret, but a complex story of human failing, of misguided love, and of his mother's fight to reclaim their reality. She would be the sole narrator of his history, and she would tell it with honesty and love. Her life was no longer a story written by others. She was finally the author. Her legacy wasn't the one her mother had tried to engineer, nor the one she had tried to build with David. Her legacy was the resilience she would teach her son, the importance of a truth that was entirely their own. One sunny afternoon, she and Leo were in the backyard. She had finally opened the watercolor paper she had ordered on that terrible night weeks ago. As she watched Leo paint a gloriously messy, vibrant picture of a dinosaur, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, a peace she had not felt in years. It was not a perfect life, but it was a true one. And for the first time, it was completely, unequivocally, hers. If you were Simone, what would you have done about David? His betrayal was immense, but it came from a place of fear and manipulation, not malice. Would you have found a way to forgive him and co-parent Leo together, or was his choice to participate in the lie an unforgivable act that required a complete break? Share what you would have done below. The Detroit winter gave way to a tentative spring, and with it, a quiet, fragile sense of new beginnings bloomed in Simone's home. The storm had passed. The gossip in the community had faded to a whisper. David was gone, having moved to the West Coast to start over. Her contact with her mother was a thin, strained thread, polite, infrequent phone calls about Leo, with the vast, unbridgeable chasm of her betrayal lying unspoken between them. Simone's victory had not been loud, but its effects were profound. Her life was her own again. In the quiet months that followed her testimony, she had embarked on a new, deliberate project, the careful, honest reconstruction of her own history. The discovery that her most cherished memory was a lie had been a devastating psychological blow, making her question every part of her own story. The healing, she discovered, was not in forgetting, but in the conscious act of creating new, authentic memories. On their kitchen counter, where David's laptop had once sat, there was now a large glass jar, labeled "Our Story Jar." Every Sunday evening, she and Leo would sit together. Leo would draw a picture of his favorite moment from the week, and Simone would write down a corresponding memory on a small slip of paper. It might be as simple as the taste of the hot chocolate they'd had at the park, or the sound of Leo's laughter as he learned to ride his bike without training wheels. They would fold the papers and put them in the jar, a growing archive of small, undeniable truths. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that love, even a mother's love, could be a devastating instrument of control, and that memory could be a beautiful, but treacherous, fiction. Her revenge had not been about destroying her mother's reputation, but about reclaiming her own narrative. She was no longer an unreliable narrator of a life written by others. She was now the fiercely reliable author of her own story, and the sole truthful historian of her son's. Her peace was not found in the silence of her enemies, but in the quiet, joyful ritual of building a future on a foundation of her own making, one true memory at a time.